Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to the most underrated albums from the biggest bands, part 2. There was a part 1 video that posted yesterday, so do check that out and then come back to watch this one here, or you can do them out of sequence if you like. And so these bands here are some of the biggest bands in all of rock, metal, alternative, making it all the way to the top. But even with all the success that they had, unfortunately some of their albums were unduly overlooked. For one reason or another. We're not always sure why that is. I'm going to try and hit on some of those reasons with each of these albums. So go ahead and join me for 10 of the most underrated albums from the biggest bands. But before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please click the button. Also leave a comment, hit like. All those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by turning on notifications, you're going to stay up to date on really cool videos just like this with the most underrated albums from the biggest bands. So, previous video, I did A through L. Now I'm going to pick up with M through Z on this here. And let's go ahead and just jump right into this thing with Megadeth Risk from 1999. It was their 8th studio album at the time. And I got a little bit of mixed feelings on this one here because it's at different times I both loved and hated this album here for the things that they did on it. But there were so many good parts on this thing that in the end of the day, I really liked this. It was the first one to feature their new drummer Jimmy DeGrazio on here, and it was the last one to feature guitarist Marty Fredrickson. So, all those things always play into this stuff, but I think it was the experimentation on it, and that's why I say I've got a little bit of a love-hate relationship with it, because it tried to merge the sort of modern sounds of the day with things like, samples, drum loops that were here, the more radio-friendly sounds that they've been doing on the 3 previous albums. And unfortunately, it just really didn't work at this point on it. They kind of needed to go another direction on it. They went too far in one way and should have been pulling back a bit. But as I said, there's also some really great tracks on this one. Prince of Darkness, Breadline, The Doctor Is Calling, and the last track on here, which is broken into 2 parts, called Time. Both of them are really, really good. I don't really know why they split it. They should have just put it all together. But this album here, and later on, it got a remix from Dave Mustaine, and I actually like that version of the album even better because they stripped away a lot of that sampling and drum loops and stuff like that that's on it and kind of pushed that more to the background and so forth. And I think that one now really stands up far superior to what I was showing you, which is the original one. Okay, next one up, Motley Crue, New Tattoo from 2000, 8th studio album from them. First one not to feature Tommy Lee on drums. So taking over was Randy Castillo from Ozzy Osbourne's band. And unfortunately, Randy Castillo passed away from cancer in 2002 at age 51. So it was a very tumultuous time for Motley Crue around the recording and then touring of this album. This was produced by Mike Klink, known for working with Guns N' Roses on Appetite and the Use Your Illusion albums. So, you did have a great drummer, Randy Castillo, coming in on this. You had a fantastic producer. This was what I would call a return to form sounding album after Generation Swine, which was, industrial beats and kind of weird things that were going on within that sort of thing, and having Tommy Lee and Nikki Sixx singing on that album here. We got Vince doing all the vocals on this one here. And Nikki Sixx said this was the album that should have come out after Dr. Feelgood. That's the way they approached this thing. So they dropped, that whole modern sound that was on the self-titled with John Corabi, which is another great underrated album. But I felt this one here is even more underrated than the self-titled one with John Corabi, which is why I didn't mention that one here. But I do love this one here, and while it's not that pristine production from Bob Rock that he did on Dr. Feelgood, it is a pretty good production job that returns the band to that classic sound. They've got some killer songs. Hell on High Heels was actually an older song that they dug out of the vaults and recorded. Then there's Treat Me Like the Dog I Am and First Band on the Moon. But the whole album, I think, is just really, really good. Okay, next one up, Poison, Native Tongue from 1993. fourth studio album from the band. This was the first one to feature guitarist Richie Kotzen taking over for original guitarist CC DeVille. And, you know, while Richie Kotzen was a shredder and certainly could do what CC DeVille, and he did it live, the band changed musical direction on this one, focusing more on the more soulful blues rock side of Poison. And you know, that was something that I think helped them. It was a maturing sound, and you know, during the rise of grunge and alternative rock and everything, it helped them and basically gave them that you know, second breath that they could you know, have in order to compete within the grunge world and so forth. Not as a grunge band, but just something else that wasn't doing the overt glam metal sounds and whatnot. The album would go gold, and they had a pretty successful hit with the song Stand, but when people talk about the stuff, they pretty much just stop at the end of the CC DeVille first three albums and so forth. So this one here, though, I think did a really nice job striking a balance, and it's unfortunate that a lot of fans didn't continue on with them as they should have, because it would have been beautiful to see what Poison could have done if they had continued with Richie Kotzen making more albums and so forth. Okay, next one up, Queen, Made in Heaven, 1995, 15th studio album, and their final to date with Freddie Mercury, and of course under the banner of just Queen, because they have made one with Paul Rodgers, but that is Queen plus Paul Rodgers. Another underrated album in and of itself, but this one here under just the banner of Queen I want to talk about. And so this one here was worked on you know, prior to the passing of Freddie Mercury, and then completed posthumously after he had passed away. But I think a lot of people overlooked this one here because they did do some re-recording of tracks that were from Freddie's solo career. And it definitely deserves the way that those songs have been treated and so forth, along with the other newer songs that have been done. And of course, they grabbed some B-sides and things like that. But this was an album that Freddie worked on. He wanted to work on one last album before his passing. So this is a true Queen album. This isn't something that was cobbled together after his passing. It was actually worked on prior to. And you know, that's something that I wish all Queen fans could know and go into and say this is a worthwhile thing. But you know, the album is also a more somber Queen effort, and I think that's part of the reason that it gets overlooked. But when it came out in 1995, I think that was what was needed. It was a very fitting tribute to Freddie Mercury, and why I think the album definitely deserves another look. Okay, next one up, Scorpions, Pure Instinct from 1996, their 13th studio album. Very classic 80s sounding album, which for me at least was not something that was going on in the 90s, but that's why it kind of baffles my mind, because it was a very 80s sounding album, and yet it's a very overlooked album, and it features two of my all-time favorite songs from Scorpions, Wild Child and Stone in My Shoe. I still absolutely love those tracks. But as a whole, the album was mellower, and perhaps that is what led to this being overlooked. But just, you know, the band was big in the 80s, so in the 90s, a lot of people weren't paying attention to those 80s bands. And here was a great album that definitely deserves another look, in my opinion. Next one up, Skid Row, Subhuman Race, 1995. Third studio album from these guys, last to feature the original lineup featuring Sebastian Bach. It was produced by Bob Rock, so that in and of itself makes it interesting to see what he did after working with Motley Crue, then Metallica, then he goes to Skid Row here, and it's arguably their heaviest album, but I think it was way too much of a musical shift for most fans to get behind. And then being that it's the mid-90s and they didn't have MTV and rock radio and stuff behind them, because that was focusing on grunge and everything at the time, a lot of people didn't get that opportunity to have the music sort of you know, shoved down their throats the way that they did, giving them a chance to warm up to it, because it was that different sound. But there's a lot of good stuff still embedded in here. My Enemy, Eileen, Into Another, Breaking Down, all of those really classic, good sounding songs in and around that more darker, heavier stuff. Next one up, U2 Pop from 1997, ninth studio album, and a continuation of the band's musical reinvention that they were doing in the 90s, and I think that in and of itself is probably the biggest thing that hurt this. But they were also incorporating beyond just that idea of alternative rock where they come from, but techno, dance, electronica, and stuff they had started on Zooropa, they just did even more on this here. And while a lot of people didn't like that stuff, I was enjoying it. They added into the samples, drum loops, drum machine sequencing, all of that sort of stuff. And I think it just turned off a lot of people. But for what I found at least really interesting was the singles and the stuff that was used for the music videos and things were remixed versions of these songs, whereas the actual album had far less of this stuff. And so while I didn't immediately jump and enjoy the singles that had come out from it, when I got the album and listened to it, I actually found the album to be much better than those singles. And so I think, had maybe they not done those remixes of the stuff that it did even more of that dance sound style stuff to it, maybe it would have been more accepted. Who knows? Okay, next one up, Warrant, Dog Eat Dog from 1992, third studio album, produced by Michael Wagner, who had worked with Skid Row, Dokken, among others. And like a lot of bands at that time, they tried to toughen up their sound, make it a more harder edge. Case in point with the first single that came off of it, Machine Gun, which for me was a complete turnoff. I didn't get this album until years later, but once I got it and found out that they had maintained some of that stuff that had made them a fan, what I was a fan of, at least, the gang vocal and the melodic, vocals that are sung over things, or when I say melodic, I should say the melody that was within that. That stuff was all there. My favorite track on this, song number 7, I think, really shows what they were capable of still doing. And this song could have appeared on either of the first 2 ones. Hollywood So Far So Good, just an absolute great song that is buried within this, that if you could get past some of that newer, harder edge stuff, there was a lot of really great classic sounding stuff still on this album too. And it was certified gold, so it did do surprisingly well. It just didn't do the multi-platinum status of the earlier albums. Okay, next one up, Winger, Pull from 1993, their third studio album. It was recorded as a trio. Paul Taylor, their keyboardist and sometimes guitar player, left to join Steve Perry's group, and so kudos to him, but that band was now down to a trio. This was probably their heaviest and most progressive album, at least at the time. And I think that the band really grew by leaps and bounds. It's one of my favorites from the group, but probably partly because of all of that. But I think the biggest thing here, we all know, 1, grunge. 2, we had Metallica throwing darts at Kip Winger in their video for Nothing Else Matters. But even more than that, the Beavis and Butthead cartoon with the dweeby little nerd kid wearing a Winger shirt. And unfortunately, all of those things really brought this one down here. But, what a lot of people don't know is that the lead single off of here, Down Incognito, was a number 15 Billboard mainstream rock chart hit, if you will. The MTV still played the video a lot, so a lot of people know that song, don't even realize it's off of this album here, but they get the greatest hits and they still know some of the newer stuff that came off of this. It just unfortunately didn't translate into sales, which is real unfortunate as to how good that album is. Okay, and the last one to talk about here for letter Z, ZZ Top, Recycler from 1990, their 10th studio album. Part of the sort of culmination in a trilogy of albums that had modernized their sound and style since Eliminator in 1983, that they continued with Afterburner in 1985, and then culminated with this here, and featured the song Double Back, which had come from the Back to the Future Part 3 movie, which did really well when that song came out, but for whatever reason didn't translate over when the album itself came out. And I don't know if that was just a matter of too much of that sound and the band, or the fans really wanted the band to return to form kind of a thing, or just the fact that it was 5 years after Afterburner kind of a thing. There were 4 pretty big Radio Tracks, My Head's in Mississippi comes off of this album, probably the most well-known of all of the singles that got released off of this thing. It was certified platinum, so it did do well, but as I said, just wrong time, too much of the same thing, that kind of stuff. But this one here, believe it or not, is actually my absolute favorite ZZ Top album. So if you're not a fan or you don't know this one, give it another listen, give it a check out, because I do think it's, while underrated, a very, very good album. And so there you go. That is 10 more of the most underrated albums by the biggest band. This was part 2. There is a part 1 that was posted yesterday. You can check it out. I will leave a link in the description to it. Do consider sharing this out on social media to help spread the word for my channel, but also get these cool kind of videos out to other people. I'm sure they'd appreciate it. All right, everyone. Take care. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.